Hello, and welcome to the launch of the second annual WTCA Trade and Investment Report. Before we get started, I'd like to remind our viewers online to please follow along on our social media channels and tweet your questions at WTCA using the hashtag T&I report. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today, Claire Casey, Managing Director of FP Analytics.
Hi, good afternoon. I am delighted to be back here today for the launch of the 2019 Trade and Investment Report. We've got a terrific panel with us here today to discuss what couldn't be a more important issue, which is how cities can effectively navigate an increasingly uncertain global economy and continue to drive growth and prosperity for their communities. So I'll just do a quick introduction of everyone here today. I have Dr. Wolf Alter, who is at the Hertie School of Governments today, but has a long career at the OECD prior to that, and is really a leading expert on inclusive growth and economic competitiveness. Ronnie DeBry, who is the director of World Trade Center Dublin, and can really offer the on-the-ground perspective on how one of the most agile cities is navigating this moment of economic disruption and positioning itself to do very well in it. Bruce Nairn, who has made a career in helping localities think through and develop effective strategies to deliver sustainable growth. And Scott Ferguson, CEO of World Trade Center Association, who not only brings to us a global view of what members around the world are experiencing today and how they're managing, but also brings the perspective of, as a former World Trade Center director himself from Halifax prior to this. I'm going to quickly run through some of the high-level results from this year's report, and then we'll just launch into a discussion with this terrific panel. So that's the social media channels. Just to start off with a quick discussion of our approach to this study. When we started working with the World Trade Center Association, we very quickly realized that the greatest asset that we had to contribute something really new to the discourse on these global economic issues was the membership itself. Together, you represent 325 cities around the world, a whopping 35% of global GDP. 1.24 billion people. It's actually more than all of these numbers because we don't have data on every single city. So these are the floor of what this membership represents, and 244 billion in FDI inflows last year. It's a really extraordinary sample of the global economy, geographically diverse, large, small, different economies structurally. So it's a great sample to start with. So what we did is, in producing this report, look at a combination of polling of WTCA members, in-depth interviews with those members, and some original quantitative analysis, trying to understand what affects city-level competitiveness, particularly in more challenging economic moments, like the one we're in today. The theme of this report is uncertainty and how you navigate that uncertainty. And when we met and in the General Assembly and had the WTCA members present, we polled them on how they felt about economic uncertainty. 83% of those polled said that they expected the global economic uncertainty in the coming year to either remain at the current high level or to actually get worse. The broader economic picture, although there was a lot of optimism at the local level. And what was driving that? 45% selected escalating trade tensions as the primary driver of this disruption, followed by geopolitical factors. And in our interviews, something else came out that we, in our office, and we spent a lot of time looking at these issues, we thought was really quite remarkable, which is the numbers don't look good. Trade growth is down. FDI has actually fallen quite precipitously. And it's a lagging indicator to start with. But those numbers might actually be veiling a far worse economic reality. Because when we talk to the membership and the people who are on the ground dealing with these issues, they noted consistently two phenomena. The first was that they saw that the companies in their areas were in some cases actually trading more and importing more, trying to get ahead of expected tariffs that might be coming down the pike. So sort of stockpiling certain supplies that they thought would be subject to higher tariffs in the future, or could be. And the other was that FDI, what might look like greenfield FDI, is in some cases actually companies moving operations to markets that seem better positioned to navigate this moment of escalating tensions. So we had numerous members talk about how they were actually attracting new investment, but that isn't actually sort of, if you look at the global economy, it's not new FDI, because it was an operation moving from one country to another to avoid some of this trade disruption that we're seeing. So some challenging circumstances. So what we did in our office with our analytical team is take this sample of 325 cities and try to understand how they're competing and what are the factors that make a city be able to weather this storm. And what we did was we defined city resiliency. And we defined it as what cities are able to buck the broader economic trend. So when their country GDP rate for a year decelerated at any point over the last 5 years, were they able to outperform their countries, decelerate less, or even grow? So we bucketed the cities that succeeded in that demonstrated that resiliency at some point in the prior 5 years, with those who did not. And we looked at those two different groups, and that comparison produced some really interesting findings that I'm just going to run through quickly. The first is that the resilient cities were all facilitating movement. We saw 44% growth in air traffic passengers in the resilient cities, which was double the growth rate in the non-resilient cities. And we saw a 4.7% growth in public transportation passengers, and that's compared to only 0.4 in the non-resilient cities. So those were really dramatic differences between the two groups. The second was that they are magnets of FDI. They were attracting FDI as a percentage of GDP in the last 5 years at twice the rate as the non-resilient cities. They have higher stocks of foreign citizens, 1.27 times the share of foreign citizens in their populations, which was around, and on average in the resilient group, about 11% of their city's population were foreign-born. They had highly educated populations. More than a quarter of their populations on average have a college education or higher. And that was 8.6% higher than the non-resilient cities. They have strong services sectors. We saw on average 3.3% growth in services as a share of GDP. And that's double the rate of the non-resilient cities. And overall, they had more diverse economies. So when we looked at the entire group, resilient and non-resilient, the 25% most diverse, so the top quartile by this measure, they were decelerating 11% less than their countries. The bottom quartile, the least diverse economies, were decelerating 4% more than their national economies. So we went on to in this report to explore what came out of the interviews, the insights that came out of the WTCA membership. And that was around how cities are navigating this moment, whether it's the sort of increased importance of city-to-city diplomacy, looking for opportunities to position yourself in a moment of disruption and make the most of it, focusing in on what's that ecosystem that makes you a magnet of investment and economic growth, or how you can build an innovative knowledge-based sector and really drive that forward. And then how the WTCs themselves can support those ambitions and goals. So I'm just going to turn it now to the panel and start out actually with Ronnie. So you're in Dublin. You're in the middle of one of the largest economic disruptions, which is Brexit, and you're uniquely positioned in that. So I thought it would be a great way to kick off our conversation to hear about how one city looked at something that is a challenge for the entire region and is turning it into something that can be a driver of growth.
Sure. So I think maybe it's a characteristic of the Irish in general, but we talk about uncertainty, and I think that what we're seeing in Dublin is, as you say, taking advantage of. We're just seeing that as an opportunity, and I mean, in terms of evidence on the ground, one of the things we do in Dublin, obviously, is help the SME sector as well as helping inbound visitors, and we've seen as a result of Brexit, we've seen, and what we're hearing from people on the phone is, we want to come to Ireland as a lever into the rest of Europe. It's English speaking, it's easy, particularly from the United States even, it's the first stop. We've had a lot of inward investment in terms of even the financial sector. I don't know how many, I know you quoted it in your report, was it 27 financial firms have relocated into Dublin as a result, making that then a European headquarters. And I was listening to the chairman of the Bank of America speaking, and they've spent $400 million on bringing the new headquarters of Bank of America into the European headquarters into Dublin. And the question was put to them, what if Brexit? What if there was no Brexit now? What if it didn't happen? What if it didn't go ahead? And the attitude is, well, we can't take that chance. Like, we have to. It's done. And they're not alone. So, I mean, something, in terms of on the ground evidence, I would get a lot of taxis around Dublin. And in January, earlier this year, I was talking to a taxi driver, and there was this crazy statistic about how there was 1,000 lawyers per day coming into the country, checking it out or looking to see what was going to go on. And he just said, he just assumes now that he doesn't speak to anyone Irish in the taxi because everyone's coming in. So there's just a lot of on-the-ground indicators, but obviously FDI indicators of what's going on. And, in terms of what's going on even on an infrastructure level, we're taking advantage of that. There's a lot more houses happening, being built. There are businesses cropping up. The opportunity is being definitely very much taken advantage of, and the rest of the world can see it too.
Thank you. Scott, you're talking to everyone around the world. Your membership is seeing this from every possible perspective, and you're connecting them together as well. One of the things we heard from members again and again was how much that city-to-city diplomacy matters today. Could you comment on what you're seeing there and hearing from members?
I mean, clearly we all are aware of the fact that cities need to step up and take that leadership role to create economic opportunity for their cities. That's where the money is, the jobs, the population. Our members, of course, are city-based, and I think at a time when there's a great deal of disruption happening, you need to go to your players that are I call closer to the action, or maybe our first responders. And I think that our members are first responders at the city level. They're very organically connected. They're collaborative in their approach to business models. And when you look at our members, you'll see virtually every member has some other variation of how they conduct business. They're not all identical. So somehow we have become this very diverse organization. We've got certainly a lot of commonalities. But first and foremost, we are connected to the grassroots business operation in each of our cities. Now that means there's private sector players and public levels of government, often universities, SME organizations. But first and foremost, we're connected at that level. And then it's over that we lay this global network. And I think in the past, the idea of having a global network was maybe enough. And we talk about global indicators and measures, and it was enough to say those big numbers and those big things. So we have 300 members or 500 members. But without that local connection, I think that's just a number. And that's one area I think that we've made some significant efforts to make that connection, and we've succeeded. And so when I travel, I get individual stories and models, and there's a role of real estate, there's a role in learning and education and development, trade services, SMEs. There's all of these elements have some role to play, but they're not all identical. So cities are embracing what's important to them. World Trade Centers, I think, are filling in gaps where there's a gap, and they're using the network to get that message out. And I think the role that we play is that global connector piece, but only after we've learned and connected on the grassroots level.
Those connections are also local, right? So we're seeing World Trade Centers often be the connector between the public and private sectors, and bringing different stakeholders together. That's something we hear time and again in our interviews with members. Bruce, you spent a lot of time working with localities, thinking about how they position themselves, how they develop their strategy for economic competitiveness. How do those relationships best work from your experience?
I think from a city perspective, or from a local authority perspective, which is probably my background, it's always worth thinking, well, what is it that we want trade for? What is it that we want these things for? It's really for the benefit of people's lives. And so we need to find a common language where the public and private sectors work together around place. There's a lot at the moment, certainly in the UK, about what we call place making and place shaping. And that's about setting a vision for a place and a narrative for a place, about what you want it to be, about building on its assets, about building what's on its strengths, and about promoting these strengths in a kind of consistent sort of way. I don't think that that can just come from the public sector. That has to be about people from all different sides batting for your areas, really, acknowledging what their strengths are and building on them. There was a lesson that I learned years and years ago when I was a junior researcher in a local authority, and we had something called an economic partnership. This was in Brighton and Hove. And it was led by quite a charismatic local character. He used to talk about Brighton and Hove being digital, creative. You don't have to wear suits in Brighton to do business. A bit alternative, but very creative. And I used to say, but Simon, all the numbers, they say it's pretty, public sector employment. It's sort of fairly low-level tourism jobs. But he was right. And the reason why he was right, because he talked about the place as he saw it in 5 or 10 years' time, not now. It was based on some truth and based on certainly reality. It wasn't based on nothing. But it was based talking today about how you see your city in the future. And it was much more visionary then at the time than I was. Not that I'm necessarily visionary now, but it was a really good lesson for me about everybody talking up their places, about how they see them in the future and developing a common vision.
I think tease up where I want to turn the conversation. Rolf, you bring the rigor of an economist to this question. You've been looking at this issue for a long time, economic competitiveness. Now we have a new context. What do you think the role of the private sector is? Where do they sort of drive the leadership on this?
Well, you see, the private sector, I think, is where jobs are created, where investment is made, where innovation is produced. So, of course, the role of the private sector is essential. There's no doubt about it. But at the same time, we live in a very connected world, not only globally, regionally. We live in a world where many, many players have to come together to make a good performance happen. I think cities are a place where I used to say policies and people meet. Mm-hmm. And I do think that is still the case. And I don't want to go back to a discussion about whether it's the public sector or the private sector. I think the key is for success to be materializing, you need the players to come together. Yes, you need a vision. Yes, you need a plan. But you need also to have a place where you can actually talk to each other. And I really mean talk to each other. Why is it so important? Because that's in the middle of trust that you need. Private sector, though, has typically a very clear idea about what it is that needs to happen. Resilience, though, I have to say, is a broader concept than just saying we have to get through the next year, our business year, well. Resilience of cities means that you have to provide places, jobs, schools, transportation, health. All of it had to come out of this combination of business people, a very dedicated government, but also of the other stakeholders. And I think your group here, I would say, is one of these ingredients for, let me say and use this word, for good governance. Yeah. Because whatever we want to do, if we don't get it right, that we work to the same objective, it will just simply fail. And if I may, just one comment. Navigating Uncertainty. I think it's a fantastic title. Hits very well the time. No, it's the spirit of the times. But let me still say, we always navigate uncertainty. So we should be a little more comfortable. Risk, yes, but risk also means opportunity. And I do think that we should not lose sight of these fantastic potential that we also unlock. Uncertainty is part of business, but it's part of profits and of course also of losses. So just let's be comfortable and just have the confidence that we will manage through this time if we get that consensus. And cities, I think, that's the place to be. As you said, Scott, it's where it happens. And if I may add, think ahead today. I call it, it's this, we're living in the century, in the metropolitan century. Cities will be at the heart of everything that we do. And by the end of this century, we can now count on about 85% of the world population living in cities. So confidence, I can only say, if you manage well with your stakeholders, there's a good chance to get it right.
Great, thank you. Trying to shift this into a bit more of a discussion between the panelists and not just me asking questions, I'm going to throw out a broader question to the group and hopefully we can engage in some conversation about it, which is to follow on that. What are those key elements to developing the ecosystem of a competitive and resilient city in your mind in this current economic context and going forward? Understanding uncertainty will always be part of the mix. We heard from WTCA members from around the world that consistently they were talking about having a clear vision of where you wanted your city to go, having the right and attractive policy and regulatory structures, having really transparent policy making, and clear channels for communication between the public and private sectors. But I'd love to get, you all bring such a different perspective to this. Maybe you could kick us off, Scott, but I'd love to get your different perspectives on this question.
Yeah, for me, it kind of comes down to one word, which is collaboration. I think on one side, cities are not always financially positioned to take on all the challenges they have. In many countries, they get responsibilities downloaded to them and they don't have the ability to generate funds through taxation and other ways. So they're in a tough position, but they also represent the greatest opportunity to further the economy of the countries that they reside. So for me, and cities often have many public and private organizations, levels of government, universities, chambers of commerce, all with individual budgets and individual mandates, and they can't afford to work in isolation from each other. And I think in the past, when it would come down to who's getting credit, who's getting the focus, who's getting the byline, that was kind of important. I think the key for me is collaboration. And when I travel the world and speak to members, I see elements of collaboration in each and every city where we have World Trade Centers, because they have worked with levels of government, private sector to uncover either opportunities that were there or problems that needed to be solved, and then they came together to help solve them. And it's not just a piece of real estate, there's programming that comes with it, and I think the World Trade Centers play that collaborative centerpiece. Then we overlay the global network. So for me, it's collaboration. Cities absolutely need to work together and bring all the resources they have to solve problems and to take advantage of opportunities.
I would echo that actually, because one of the things that actually came up over lunch when we were discussing about the trade accelerator that's been done through one of it's trickling down through the rest of them. We're doing something similar now in Dublin, and what makes innovation and collaboration happen and helps it along is actually education as well. So making information freely available and talking about your clear channels of communication, I think that's really important too, because a lot of entrepreneurs know what they want to do, they don't necessarily know how to do it. And I kind of think of World Trade Centers as being like an entrepreneurial safe house where you can come and get what you need. And we use our network to be able to help progress happen. And the public-private thing is interesting because we sit right in the middle of it, and facilitating education and innovation and being supporters of that and drivers of helping entrepreneurs realize their vision is really important, because sometimes we don't always see that from the public sector as much as they want to do it. There's too much that gets lost in bureaucratic inertia. So I think it's really important to add the education piece with the collaboration piece as well.
Returning us to the question of small entrepreneurs, small and medium-sized enterprises, we know they're huge drivers of job creation, growth. This environment, they have much fewer resources than a large multinational corporation that might get more attention, but they're really driving a lot in the economy. Rolf, what do you see as the sort of unique challenges for these businesses? What do they need to navigate this time?
What do they have? I would
do they
first
have?
of all say,
All right.
what do they have? They have something that's probably an ingredient for success that we sometimes simply take for granted. It's not just the commitment, but it's also talent. In various forms, of course. But I think SMEs, I have to say SME sounds a little sort of, we are talking about the economy of the last century, I would rather say we're talking today a lot about the startups and companies that are emerging because relatively young people get together and do something anew, and they take a risk and they would like to test it. But that's true. SMEs would do the same.
Right.
Establishment of a company, as we would call it before, you will work on it and you will actually try to do exactly the same. But we have a different expression now, and I would like to acknowledge that that has moved. But what it also needs is, of course, access to finance. There's no way around it. You will somehow have to support that. And what you also need is, you need people that would want to work with them. So we're coming back to collaboration. Nobody can do this on his or her own. You will need to do it with someone else. And typically, why is it, if you look at startups, in many cases, even if you take now the very famous ones, there were 3 or 4 of them who set it up together. And what was it? It was probably an excellent mix of talent. And that made them hit something. We never speak about those that go out of business. We always see the success stories, but that's also part of it. And here we back to your title, Navigating Uncertainty. But I will say SMEs, what they certainly also need, a good regulatory framework. Mm-hmm. When you think about what it takes to run a business, it's not just the idea, you also have to navigate in an infrastructure. Not least the government, but also your friends, but also your competitors. And good rules of the game, which can be influenced by local government, would be perfect. Would be really perfect. Last but not least, though, even if it gets a little more or less important because of the way that many of these SMEs operate today, you will have to look for good infrastructure. And infrastructure, by that I really mean physical infrastructure. You will have to deliver something somewhere. Or you have to at least a very good infrastructure in terms of your technology. And many governments around the world are struggling a lot. You know that. Not everybody has access to all these wonderful ways of communicating. So if you are sitting somewhere where it's not available, that's a big disadvantage. You don't need to be in the city necessarily, but you need to have access to these kinds of services. What does it show? Success is not just an issue of an individual who has a great idea and has a talent. It also is the result of other people's playing with this and opening up the opportunity, help create it, and then use it.
Bruce, I can tell you have something to respond to
Yeah,
that.
it's. I don't want to say agree with everybody and say yes, it's all about collaboration, but there's a lot of things which flow in from that, and I think, and just when I read through your report, I was going, yes, tick, tick, tick. None of those things particularly surprised me. Collaboration, trust, openness, all those things hang together. But there's one of the things that I do want to mention, which is about livability. And I always used to, years ago, thinking, well, there seem to be good places in which to live in and good places in which to work in. And our challenge, I think, as cities is to be a good place to live and work in. Because if you want to attract talent, you want to be a nice, decent place to live. So what constitutes a nice, decent place to live? Safety, certainly. Good public sector, good public services, good education, safe to get around, easy to get around. Because if you are competing on an international stage, what are the places that are good to live in? I did some work in Gibraltar for World Trade Center Gibraltar a couple of years ago. And when I spoke to some of the businesses in World Trade Center, Gibraltar, I was conscious that Gibraltar was competing actually with Amsterdam because people are used to leisure and people who are used to live, highly able people who are used to living in Amsterdam. They don't just want to work. They want good other facilities. They want good leisure time. They want good places to eat. They want good places to go out. So we need to think more just in terms of the businesses and the World Trade Centers, but what else has the city's got to offer in terms of competing for talent?
And if I can even just add to that infrastructure comment, because one of the areas that the WTCA contributes significantly is the infrastructure place, because the role that the World Trade Center plays as a central rallying, connecting point in the city is important. A few examples: Gibraltar's been mentioned, where there was a lack of significant office infrastructure space for companies they were looking to retain. But also Asuncion, Paraguay is another example where the economy was booming with very limited space. The World Trade Center came in to build a 4-tower complex to help with that, solve that problem. In Sydney, Australia, essentially recognizing the relocation of the airport, and the new airport is going to be located, centered by a World Trade Center development, and it's all in and around the need to expand the airport in that city. And the World Trade Center in Harbin in China, we talked a little bit about at lunch today, where there's close to 30 million square feet of space being built, all in and around agricultural innovation, and that includes all levels of government: Chinese government, local businesses, universities, and learning, et cetera. So even though we are very diverse as an organization, infrastructure plays a big role and a big part in our value proposition.
Maybe I would add here, that it's important to look at really what we exactly mean by a city.
Yeah.
There are different definitions, but won't go there. But what I think is important, that we look at it as an economic space, and it doesn't end necessarily where your city limits are. The economic space typically is very different from it. You take large cities that have communities around them. Do you really want to say, well, I'm coming from Paris. There's something which is called Le Périphérique. This is a ring road. Some people think they have never really gone across that périphérique because that's the old world. No, it is something where you say, what's the economic relevant size that you're looking at? And I do think that's an important question that we need to keep in mind. I will say, you see, in the Netherlands, I remember this very well. It's an extraordinary case. The harbor, Antwerpen and Rotterdam, and then the Den Haag, the capital. They felt that they were too small to cope with what is needed today, so they got together. But not only those two, but also the 22 other communities around them, and created a sort of a board of those communities that share the same interest. And what was the main important issue that they wanted to address? That you can commute in every direction, and that there is actually a train, and there is a street, or there is ways to go across. And why it's important? Because you need to have the mobility for labor, but also the mobility for your customers. And of course, you also need your mobility for getting to school, to the school you would like. So the concept of city needs to be adjusted to economic reality rather than having 24 different governments thinking about the same thing. Where do we build the road? Unfortunately, though, it had to meet the two ends of the road. Otherwise, it would not be so important.
And Ralph, we see emerging capital cities and expansions happening all around the world, greater economic areas taking on the name of the city and the brand as well. You mentioned the Netherlands. We have 12 World Trade Centers in that fairly restricted geographic space, but all very, very active, and active with private sector as well as government, and always heavily involved in our board, but also heavily involved in some of our programming. In France, we have the same number of World Trade Centers. In Paris, there will be a new World Trade Center that's going to be under construction shortly. In Metz here, we've got a beautiful historic building that we visited yesterday, that respects the nature of this, this fabulous downtown core and history of the city, but also has a very functional role with businesses. Great.
Great. I wanted to talk a bit about technology. Often when we're talking about disruption these days, we're talking about Brexit or US-China trade tensions. But there's a bigger disruption that's been happening in the global economy, which is technologically driven. And that presents, again, all sorts of new opportunities, but also increases the pace of change and introduces new risk. I'm hoping you could comment on the fact that we heard from all the members that the knowledge economy, innovation is key to their future. I know Dublin is going that direction. Maybe you could kick off this part of our discussion in talking a little bit about how technology is playing through both the uncertainty and also the opportunity.
Yeah, so definitely. One of the things, I mean, in Ireland, it's such a small country that, we have no choice but to communicate and be visible on a platform to the rest of the world. And one of the challenges that was faced within the World Trade Center network, obviously, was the strength of our network is also the weakness of our network in terms of being able to communicate with each other at a speed that is beneficial to our members. And technology is the one thing that enables that to make that happen. So in terms of having a platform, we obviously have the WebPort Global platform, which I know is mentioned in the report. So, in terms of having a platform where you're a verifiable entity rather than, you can go on many other platforms and having a presence online isn't necessarily a credible piece, but through the World Trade Center network, we're able to say, we can help our members represent themselves and also represent ourselves. And use technology to communicate in an instant with one of our other network members around the world, and provide a marketplace and a shop window for our members, because the members of all of our World Trade Centers become members because what they want to do is tap into our networks. But I think it's really, really important that we use all of the tools at our disposal, not just our relationships. So we have a lot of relationship equity. But I think we need to use all of the tools at our disposal to make it much easier to facilitate our members being able to do business with each other. And that's just actually what people are expecting now. I mean, it's possible to travel from one country to another without speaking to another human being, because everything is automated, everything is technology driven. And I think that we need to embrace that and use that to enhance our power as a network.
Well, how do you think that structural economic change is changing the game for competitiveness?
The jury is out. Huh? If you look at really very intelligent, very experienced, very dedicated research that takes place, I think you hear all kinds of guarded projections of what it really means. Of course, we all know that it means, for sure, changes in the labor market. We know, of course, that everybody says we have to train people up. We have to educate them well. But I don't think if you take the speed for granted and assume that it continues like that, it will not be education, it will be actually lifelong learning. I mean, how will you ever want to keep up with it if you're not doing it every day? So this idea that education once will equip you with all the capacity and after that you're fine, I don't think that that's the case. But what I would want also, really, I think we're getting there a little more now. There is really in the discussion of what does it also mean in terms of resilience. Do you know what you need to run a very, very good communication systems? Most? Electricity. So when you think about it, how we need to make sure that we talk about redundancy. It's something that has gone out of business, this expression. Redundancy. But I do think that we will have to come back to it. There are actually people in the US who would say we need to make sure that we have more competition in this area. We need to make sure that there is enough investment taking place. Just because you want to be sure that you are neither depend on one provider, nor you want to be depending on purely privately run business. Very, very important changes that go beyond the technology. And the last point, you see, for many of the services that are today being provided by the private sector, you have a market. So that's just perfect. You can have it or you don't. You can pay for it or not. There are though also services that are provided by government to people who need these services. Unemployed people, poor people, people who have no education, no access to a computer, let alone that they know how to operate it. So what we do with these people? Even a country like Denmark, which we all know has declared by default it had to be technology, they have discovered that there are 25 to 30% of the population that has no access. So how do we do this then? And I think, again, very important that when you provide services, whether it's private or whether it's public, you will have to think about it. Do we in the end create livable conditions for people? Huh? Because even the economy is just a means to an end. So we need to be sure that we don't sort of forget about these potentially disadvantaged people, some of them very real today, others we can probably still discover a few more. But it's an important issue. So structural change due to what we call the revolution, the technological revolution, I think we will have to be very close at the issue, very close to make sure that we don't miss anything.
We're running out of time. I think, Bruce, you wanted to say
Yes, just one
something.
other point that I'd like to add, which came out, which struck me in the report, which was quite interesting, which was the importance of face-to-face contact. And there's this kind of concept, isn't there, of technological flattening. So, which means what technology enables us to do is to live somewhere, work somewhere else. I've been working locally in England, even though I live 1,000 miles away in Warsaw. It's been possible to do that. But we're also talking about agglomeration, more people living in cities. So there is some sense here where technology is not enough, or isn't enough, to build up trust, to develop relationships, to have what we call in England sort of water cooler conversations, the soft intelligence which builds social capacity. So I think, yes, of course, there's huge changes going on, but we perhaps mustn't underestimate the importance of face-to-face contact in building trust and building relationships. And I think that came out in the report.
It certainly came out in all our reviews. So I was just thinking when you're saying going back to some old concepts, some of those old concepts is human relationships and actually connecting to each other. And that's sort of at the heart of this association. So we should open this up for questions, but I might just turn to Scott for some closing thoughts on that front.
Well, just a couple of things that we talked about: infrastructure for sure, and education. SMEs, we touched on at lunch as well. Last year's report showed that while SMEs provide 70% of jobs in the OECD countries, they only trade cross-border to the extent of 10%. So that's an area that we can have a major impact in, I believe. We have members who are heavily involved. Our World Trade Center in Mumbai is one example where they run programs, very extensive programs focused on the SME market. The other is immigration and talent retention. And World Trade Center in St. Louis, big brand. They're playing for the Stanley Cup Finals tomorrow night. So if you want to tune in at 2 a.m., I don't know if I will or not. I'd love to. They're playing Boston. But in any case, a city of just shy of 300,000 people, and they've got an extensive Mosaic program that the World Trade Center branded and created in that city to retain international students. And when you look at Twente, same thing, right? Where retaining students that are studying in the marketplace. It was a manufacturing area, now turned into more of a high-tech area. Education and retaining talent, immigration is a big part. So, all of our members, for the most part, will touch on one, if not all, of those topics that we talked a little bit about today and then are talked about in the report. But I go back to just maybe one last word in addition to collaboration. You mentioned innovation a few moments ago as well. I really think the majority of innovation comes from organizations that are fairly small and nimble and close to the action. And I think that it really defines our World Trade Centers. Now, maybe it's like the French World Trade Centers that are heavily involved with chambers of commerce and many individual businesses. But invariably, our members are very close to the action and very close to individual SMEs that are trying to do business. And I think in addition to helping those businesses, that's where the true innovation is going to come from. And our opportunity, of course, is how do we feed that into the system so that all World Trade Centers can take advantage of it.
Thank you. I think we'll open it up for questions from the audience or from the people who are watching online.
Sorry, this one came in online from Denis in Athens. There's a lot of disruption now, tariffs, Brexit, etc. What is the light at the end of the tunnel, the silver lining?
Who wants to take that? Or all of you?
I'll just make maybe one comment that with all of this disruption and confusion, I think that it actually creates a bigger opportunity for our network. And I think it's for the reasons we've talked about today, where big government, big corporations, macroeconomic numbers and trends, may not be as effective in the past. In the present as they were in the past. And I think it's going to come down to organizations that are nimble and focused at the grassroots level. We rely on personal one-to-one connections with trust and transparency. And I think that's really how you get through this, is you kind of go under it, you maintain your connections, and you continue to grow that way.
Encourage not only to put the lights on so that we see the end of the tunnel, but also I think it would be very important that we not forget where these developments that you have heard from Athens are actually coming from. So we need to be also looking at what are the sources of the current disruption. Not everything is sort of coming in technology or is coming from somewhere. Much of the disruption is the consequence of previous policies and previous decisions taken by people. So those that have provoked the current, perhaps a little stronger uncertainty that we see, they need to be addressed. And I will be clear, one of the things that we will need to make sure is that we no longer divide societies, but unite them. And I think there had to be a bit more emphasis put on that one. That would be helpful for getting to the end of this tunnel.
Bruce.
I'll just say, when I first arrived in Metz yesterday, I came out of the railway station and I bumped into this chap who said, "Oh, can I help you? Can I help you? Where are you trying to get to?" So I explained, and he was ever so friendly. I said, "That's a very nice welcome I've had to Metz." He said, "Where are you from?" I said, "Oh, I'm from Brighton." And his first response was, Brexit. So, but what I want to say is that I think the lesson here is nothing is linear. So the enthusiasts, I think, sometimes tend to be over-optimistic about the way the world will end up, and the naysayers tend to be pessimistic about the way the world will end up. The reality is, it's probably somewhere in the middle, and there'll be a few bumps on the road. But we just have to ride those bumps effectively, and not be over impressed by the enthusiasts, and not be too disheartened by the naysayers.
Sure. This one actually comes from Maggie in New York. And she says, what do you think is the first step? What's the priority that cities should be doing now?
Yeah, please.
I really think that, and this is, I don't know if this is radical or not, but I guess we live in times where what was once obvious is now radical. But going back to education, I think if cities who are responsible, so within education systems, we're teaching children the traditional skills, maths, English, science, all of that. I think that these skills are becoming probably more and more redundant. And education, everyone teaches kids about what's happened in the past. Let's look at the history. Let's see where we've been. I think that if we could teach our young people where we're going, if we could teach more entrepreneurship, if we could equip people to understand that actually maybe the old vision, which is linear, which is, go to school, go to college, graduate, get a job, I think that that's not the case anymore. I think everyone wants to work for themselves. I think people are relying more and more on their personal brands. Everyone's living on a screen. They want to be permanently mobile. I think if cities were quick enough to be able to adapt their thinking and facilitate things like using technology to let people work remotely, like you've embodied and done quite successfully, I think if we could trickle that right down into the education system from the grassroots level and build that into what we're currently teaching our young people, I think that would have a radical impact, because, the young people of, I've a child who's about to start school. In 10 years' time, he's probably going to have a business. Well, he will if I've got anything to do with it. But, this is, you hear of startups, of people who are 7 and 8 year olds who are starting a business, and they're making more money on YouTube than a lot of people make in a month. So I think it's about supporting that speed of learning, and not looking into the past, but maybe looking into the future, and understanding that we're living in a really, really increasingly rapidly changing world, and equipping our kids to deal with that.
I would add, after or next to looking into the future, they should also look to their neighbors. I think it's amazing what you can learn by just simply comparing notes with others. There's a very interesting research out that says 70% of innovation is actually copying and adapting a nice idea from somewhere else to your own circumstances. Not like one-to-one, but being inspired by it. And I think, Scott, really, perhaps it's also one of these, you do it maybe already, but I think an exchange of experience is really an extremely productive way of learning. Experience that you not by saying, I have a solution for you, or can I get your solution, but get the experience of success and failure. If you are in an honest group, you will also have people who say, I'm so sorry, but it just didn't work as I thought, so you don't need to repeat the mistake. But learning from experience is something perfectly suitable. And I think cities today are already encouraged to work together. You can see it. Some very important mayors have created these networks. But I think it's not just the big 5 cities in the United States and the 2 in Europe that should cooperate. I think it should be something that happens among them. And when I say cooperation in this case, I really mean, has something worked well for you in terms of a resilient structure? Let me know what it was, so then I can take it home, and I will discuss it at home, and we'll see whether we can follow up on it. It's a real interesting source of improvement.
Ralph, and I'll add to that. I think that we've focused on that over the last several years. I mean, historically, 50 years behind us, we're celebrating our 50th year. We've had various levels of that, but I really see over the last several years that we've done that. I see it from politicians and from city officials who start to recognize the World Trade Center brand and the role that we can play in trying to be a centerpiece and collaborative international connector. So it's all about what this association is about, right? It's about learning from each of our members, no matter what part of the world you're in, and we have to make sure we have vehicles in place to make those connections, not just personally at these meetings, but the way we use our newsletters and other kinds of tools, and this report for that matter, because when you go through this report, you'll see a long list of very specific examples of where individual World Trade Centers are championing and leading something in their city, and it's a great tool. Words well spoken. We'll do our best in that area. Thank you.
We are out of time. I'm going to just do a quick lightning round. Can I, Alex? One final question. We've talked about how challenging this moment can be, but I'd love if you could each quickly share where you see opportunity for cities.
Well, I think, and not to beat the same drum here, but I think collaboration, of course, cities working together, I think your World Trade Center can play that collaborative role. And I think to look at examples in other cities around the world and where that's happening, and I think there's lots of evidence of that. So I think working together is the key for us, and I think World Trade Centers play that role, and we look forward to doing that.
For cities, I think clearly it's got to be a collaborative approach, but I think cities being confident of who they are, what they are, and what they want to be, and getting a clear narrative about that, which is not a top-down narrative, but which binds different stakeholders in. So we all kind of have some sense in our head of certain cities around the world, whether they're that or not. They're not quite sure. But I think getting a clear identity is a really, really useful thing to do.
Yeah, I think, and just based on the experience and what we're seeing in Dublin, I think not being afraid, and that comes partly with the confidence, being brave enough to try and disrupt something and turn it on its head and try something new. We were talking over lunch about the peer-to-peer lending, which is completely starting to disrupt our economic system in terms of how entrepreneurs raise money. Trying something new, being brave, being creative, and trying to break the rules a little bit, which is probably not what any economist wants to hear. But
Listen. That would be my advice. Listen. There is so much to pick up, and I think listening makes you finding better answers.
Great. Well, some interesting answers here today. Thank you all for joining us, and thanks to everyone who participated here and around the world.
Thank you very much.